Hello and welcome to another episode of the Christian Reeve podcast. Today's guest is a poet, a writer, a teacher, and so much more. His name is Anthony Vernon David. Welcome to the show. How you doing?
Thank you for having me, and just be willing to take the time to just chat because I love just chatting and just, especially as the educated part of what you said, it's always good to just chat and share information to the best of my ability.
Absolutely, man. To be honest, sometimes when I look back over the years of doing this show, I do look at it from an education perspective, as in like there's hundreds of episodes and they've all got different life lessons, different experiences, stories, all this like wealth of information. And I'm like, that, if nothing else, is valuable. That's something. Like if you were to ever access this in the future, you'd learn so much, and like every single person knows something that you don't, has experiences you can benefit from, and so on and so forth. It's incredible, really.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that's one of the important things that's often forgotten about education. It's not necessarily about particular sets of factual information. It's about exposure to experiences and understandings. And I think that often gets lost in education because as time goes on, things are more pointed towards standardization, and for good reason, right? Like we're in a more and more scientific society, we're in a more capitalistic society globally over time, and so there are more needs for plug and play, like, okay, so this is going to equal this, that is going to equal that, and it's going to equal that in all cases, and there's less focus on experiential understandings or subjective understandings, and more like, no, we need to make sure that like A is A, B is B, and that the answers to things. So I think having the internet space with a lot of podcasts is really good at filling that void, and I think that's part of why podcasts are becoming so popular, because they're filling that educational void of experiential understandings that's being lost in an educational system that's more and more deviating away from the humanities for both good and bad reasons.
I agree with you on the education standpoint, but I don't know, you lost me at podcasts.
Well, I mean,
don't get me
but
wrong,
think about
there's
it.
go on.
But think about it, like people are watching like academics on podcasts to like the millions.
Right.
Like Joe Rogan's one of the most popular podcasts in the world, and some of his most viewed episodes are not with like entertainers that he brings on and stuff. But a lot of his most viewed episodes are with academics. So there seems to be this void for some people in education to get that experiential side of education that's being lost. To hear the experiences of academics, to hear their subjective understandings, to get them in more of a casual setting, as education kind of began in the Western tradition with the academy and the symposium, where things were a little more free flowing in their uh, what's the word I'm looking for, curriculum.
Yeah, I guess like where I was coming at it was more just like when you look at obviously podcasts in general, it's heavily oversaturated, and a lot of what you see are like controversial, silly podcasts. Like there's this one that I heard of the other day. I just want to quickly nip this in the bud and talk about some like interesting stuff. But since we're talking about it, like there's a show, there's some trash podcast in America where like they get like eight people in a room, like
Yeah,
loads of people. So I'm sure you've seen this, but it's like for
I know what you're
anyone,
talking about.
I don't know what it's called. I can't remember, but it like every
They
show.
have like a black background and white text, and they're like a manosphere podcast. And I know
That's
like
one
the
of
YouTuber
them. Yeah,
Chad has made fun of them. Yeah.
that's well, this is the thing. I think there's more than one because this particular show had all women on it. There was only one male host, and I wasn't getting that vibe. But I know the show that you're talking about, and they have the exact same chair layout. It's like, oh gosh. But shows like that seem to be the most popular podcast wise because it appeals to the younger generation, the kind of like instant gratification, like, oh my God, shocking, like let's clip this up, 30 seconds of like outrageous stuff. But the ones that you're talking about, the shows where you can actually learn something, that kind of adheres more to like the classic style of podcasting, which is what I subscribe to. Like that's why I do a podcast. I mean, yeah, I would love it to go somewhere, but even if it doesn't, I'd like to have a bank worth of about 10 years. That's what I've put myself at. We're at four now, 4 years in. A bank of information, a bank of experiences, life stories, and everything in between. But what you said just there is crucial getting people comfortable enough to talk about these things. And I think maybe the reason that those shows, say with Joe Rogan, do so well is not just because of who it is and who he's talking to and the fact that it's an interesting conversation, but it's tricky trying to get someone like as a host, like for those listening, you might wonder like what are the trickier parts of being a host? Well, I've always spoken about the research angle of things, but the actual harder part is getting people comfortable enough to have a conversation and then get asked the right questions as well. Part of the reason why Joe Rogan's so good at what he does is because he's a good active listener. He does his research and he knows how to kind of adjust himself to each guest. And I do the same thing. Like it's so crucial to do that. So, for example, a quick example would be like if your guest is quieter, then as a host, you need to kind of take the reins in that conversation and steer it a bit more and probe a bit more to get more out of your guest. If your guest is more chatty, then it becomes more about steering and making sure your guest doesn't go off on too many tangents and trying to kind of navigate that. You might even have to interject every now and again. But the point is what's required of you as a host changes each and every time. But I always go back to like that the how knowing what to ask is crucial.
And in a weird way, like I guess to transition out of this, but bounce off of it, like an educator in a weird way has to do the same thing. Like
Mm.
a lot of, you have to, your guest would be your students, right? In a sense. And you have to like, different classrooms are going to have different vibes, different subjects are going to have different vibes, even different times of the day, you're going to have to adjust. I've been very lucky to teach at like a variety of levels, from the university level all the way down to second grade. Well, actually, technically, in my current well, I should say current role, but the role I'm transitioning out of, I've even done reading intervention for first graders. So it's one of these things where I've worked with in an educational space from first grade all the way to university. And that's the similarity is that need and ability to adjust not just to individuals and their educational needs, but this flexibility is one of these things that's much needed. And I think one of the things that's missed out on by the educational space, it's becoming more and more standardized. It's becoming more and more difficult to suit individual needs, even though there's research, especially in the SPED space, talking about how we need to create more outlets and more means for individuals to learn and, more ways in which students can engage with particular materials. This stuff is going away in a economy that demands more and more specialization. And again, this isn't a bad thing. Specialization yields a lot of positive results. It's counter to the way humans developed, because evolutionarily we developed to do a lot of different things. We weren't just hunters. We were hunter gatherers. We're scavengers. We're tool makers. We're a lot of different things from a pre-civilizational standpoint, proto-civilizational standpoint. There was specialization is a very, very new thing relative to humans. I mean, if you're, able to listen to this podcast, you don't know a time before specialization, but even in the midst of specialization, we still like seek out other things and have other interests and desires. So it's this tough sort of thing where it's like the rewards of specialization are very obvious and evident, but they are counter to the ways in which we learn best. So it's this tough balance of like, okay, we have found as of right now, a good system to produce materials and improve well-being to a large degree, but simultaneously, this is counter to the way in which we naturally pick up information.
Well, everything in life goes in cycles, right? So allow me to be a historian for a moment. Hundreds of years ago, you had the idea of the Renaissance man, the idea of someone being able to, for instance, read, write poetry, speak several languages, play an instrument, etc., etc. That was the expectation upon most people. That was what you were expected to do. Obviously, with the advent of the industrial age and everything, we moved more towards specialisms, as you were sort of outlining there. Like that was the shift. Now, and I explored this in a podcast a few years ago on an episode where I spoke about multipotentiality and polymathy. And that's where I sort of researched Renaissance Man and kind of that whole wormhole happened. So if you haven't checked out that podcast, go check it out, guys. Anyway, what I noticed is that the shift now is more back towards the Renaissance Man. That's the expectation. For example, let's say you're a content creator. You have to be a marketeer, a salesman, a graphic designer, like all these different things. If it's an office job, let's say marketing, that was what I trained in years ago. Same thing. You've got to be prepared to be asked to do a lot of different things that are not what you signed up for. That's just the expectation. And I don't know. I mean, like I said before, I think these things do go in cycles, but I don't know that we'll ever get to another cycle where it becomes about specialisms again. I mean, it might do. There's always a need for specialisms, and there always will be. But generally in society, what I'm seeing, especially in the workplace, is this expectation to be trained in a lot of different areas, which for some of us is easy to pick up on, also easier to pick up. For other people, that's a real struggle to, like, maybe you're really good at one thing, but you struggle with the other things, but you still have to do them, you
I
know?
mean, I know what you're saying, definitely, but I guess I was very much speaking particularly to educational spaces. And obviously, of course, in educational spaces, people are taught multiple subjects,
Mm-hmm.
but one, education lags behind societal trends.
Right. Yeah.
Um, because let's say like go with the content creators or the business people, right? There is incentive to innovate, right? Whereas in education, you think there'd be the same incentive, but not really. The incentivization in education, especially in the United States, is on scoring tests properly. Even in the state of Oklahoma, this is the 49th ranked state in the United States, and 49th in the United States is still better than most countries. But obviously, for the developed world, it's an unfortunate embarrassment. I just to put it
Okay.
bluntly. And they're testing third graders on standardization tests, and these like and the scores aren't getting any better, but they just keep on throwing standardized tests at a brick wall. And educational spaces lag behind in this sort of regard of transitioning back to the Renaissance man, which is a pretty recent trend because one, uh, doing these sort of things like testing someone on being a Renaissance man is a lot harder. You need to show numbers, you need to show data, so that way uh, limited money within a given state can actually be funneled towards education as opposed to a giant archway at the Oklahoma City Capitol building. So stupid stuff like that, but it does happen where it's like at least in education, like it's actually going the opposite direction of where society is going. It's actually hyper specializing more. Every taught is being taught closer to the same because all classes kind of have the same goal, where it's like we need to make sure that we pass this standardized test. And there are countries that do this better, right? Like Japan, has like an end of like your entire school test, but it's one single test. Like you aim for that test, and then throughout your educational time, I mean, there's still grading and marks and etc. But it's not the same in the United States where there's this weird conflation of like we still have sort of the old systems of like you're working on this class, you're working on this class. The United States, there's this weird injection later on of standardized testing, whereas in East Asia there was always the Confucian test, right? The that was how you earned a governmental job, is you took a test basically on the Confucian understands, Confucian rituals, Confucian governance. And so there was that system there. So it's long in there. Whereas sort of in the West, we had, again, as you're talking about with, these Renaissance man ideas that the true educated man is someone who learns Latin and Greek and mathematics and right is more, they're aiming for a lot of things. Whereas in East Asia, a lot of it was aimed towards like, can you pass the Confucian exam to earn a governmental position? So the reason why, like, certain countries, I mean, Finland's is a weird case in how they do things, and a very successful case is that the Western countries are built more towards these Renaissance man ideas in the educational spaces, but the economies that that the West has built are simultaneously aimed towards hyper specialization. And these new injections are, I think, a result of kind of discontent with hyper specialization. I think there's starting to become this discontentment, and people want to have this flexibility and also realize a need for this flexibility, because ultimately, now that we're no longer an industrial society, we're a service sector society. Well, to serve someone is much more multifaceted, is much more subjective than being the individual who's mining coal, to being the individual that's placing the pinhead on the needle, as Adam Smith would talk about. So and it's interesting to see these transitions, but the educational space in the West is going to lag behind that for a while, and then it's going to catch up later. And maybe even by the time it catches up, maybe we do have a cycle, although I'm not very Hegelian when it comes to history in regards to cycles, but that's neither here nor there. But let's say if there is another cycle, then education might be in a renaissance phase where, oops, now the economy is now re-aiming towards hyper specialization. So it's just kind of a tough sort of thing where it's like education always lags behind because it's using it's just because of funding, because it uses certain standards and methods, because it's aiming for principles, and you have to change laws and implementations. And especially in the United States, where things are state by state, things kind of move. There isn't like a standard sweeping thing like the Soviet Union, where like, okay, all the schools are going to do this now. In the United States, even counties can have particular powers over their schools to a large degree. So yeah, it's kind of one of those things where I do agree with you. In larger society, there is a push, but the educational space, this is the opposite trend is happening in a weird sort of way. There's this like juxtaposed kind of drifting of this idea of, are we specializers, or are we trying to be diverse in our abilities?
You touched on a few things there. I mean, number one, I suppose really it always comes down to the demands of the society at that given point in time. So a lot of this standardized testing stuff is because many employers out there want, oh, you have to have these particular test scores. Like, for instance, here in Europe, the big four, as they call it, companies like KPMG, I don't know, they might have changed this recently, but when I was at uni, it was always like, you need to have these particular scores to get in, et cetera, et cetera. And it was always the best of the best, would get that. So to an extent, there's that element. But then, as you said, there's all these different types of people. Like, I come from a creative background, but I worked in marketing. I did all that. So I've seen kind of both worlds. And I remember at school, like, they really didn't cater for creative people. And what I later learned is that the reason for that, at least in the UK, is that everything is matched against funding. So it's like, we need to get X amount of people in this grade boundary at the end of everything, because this justifies my paycheck as a teacher, but also the school and how much funding we get at the end of the year, because we've got this many people A star through C, etc. And as I understand, like, a lot of schools tend to be this way, where it's like you're basically trying to hit targets.
Yeah,
And
100%.
so, right. So when it comes to adjusting a curriculum, that's the main thing in mind. And that's why so many kids slip through, because it's like, well, I guess in many ways you kind of have to look at it like, well, we've got to cut our losses and focus on the kids that we know are definitely going to get this, which is not how it should be. But that's their mindset. And I was on the receiving end of that sometimes. Now, every
In the
school's going
same
to,
vein, it's tough. Just quick tangent on that.
yeah, go.
That's why there's a large need for like interventionists, right? I think that they're
Yes.
probably one of the most overlooked aspects of the educational space. My mom and my sister are both speech pathologists. I'm
Hmm.
transitioning out of a job where I'm, I guess, a reading interventionist would be the best way to put it, because with a classroom, right? Like there's also this idea that develops amongst teachers, and I think that, oh, we need to have students be equal in the classroom, and that's just a sheer impossibility, because different people have different skills. But if there was a better aim towards equitable classrooms, this would be a lot better. It's very easy to get caught up where it's like equality, 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 and I'm not. How do I want to put it? I guess in certain measures, obviously I'm pro equality, but in regards to educational spaces, this is just not a possibility. There are just students who simply excel in mathematics and literature, whatever it may be, just pinpoint different subjects. And so it's about creating equitable spaces where everyone has, a certain foundational understanding that they're able to work from. Some are going to leap higher from that foundation, but as long as everyone has a foundation where they're not left behind, then we're okay. But I think there's this hyper focus on making sure that like everyone is, on average hitting these targets, as opposed to like, hey, are students improving from a particular foundation? Like, can we establish a foundation where people can work from? I had a coworker the other day who was talking about teaching a student to write their own name, and we were talking about how amazing that is. Like, we may take it for granted the ability to spell and write one's own name, but
It's
this will be
huge.
useful for leases, for documents, and stuff like that. Where and so just but if you're if if it weren't for our intervention space, like this person would be left behind because the classroom has to be equal, right? It's like, hey, we have to move on and we have to all move through this standard thing from the state of Oklahoma. And this Oklahoma wants to teach this now and this now and this now. And this is the problem of creating an equal classroom is that it ends up, at least in educational space, it creates accidentally huge separations. Whereas opposed to you creating an equitable space, people are working from the same space, like they're in this. It's almost thinking about it like a downtown where it's like not everyone's going to have the same size building, but everyone's working within the same foundation, and as a result benefits from things working within the same area.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, not everyone's going to have the same abilities in certain areas. Like, Lord knows I would fail at maths. But the problem I found was that you didn't always have a equal fighting chance. Like, one thing that puzzled me is the kids that are excelling, that are getting those A stars and Bs, the teachers would focus on them more than the kids that were like failing. And it's like,
Yeah,
if you would, because I remember looking at it, like even back then, I knew how the school system worked, and I knew that it was based on like funding. And I was like, if you would spend more time with these kids that are failing, you could bump up the average and get more kids actually passing. I remember having this conversation with my German teacher, and because he actually like, I've told the story a few times, but basically he divided the class seating arrangement according to who was going to fail and who wasn't. So it was all the kids that were going to get A stars to the left hand side of the room, kids in the middle, B's and C's, and then all the failure kids on the far right. And he didn't spell it out, but we all just looked at each other and knew because we all knew our
yeah,
grades. And I called him out on it, and he then threw it back on me and said it was my fault, which is the wrong attitude to have. But the
yeah,
point is, that was the flaw in the system right there. There should have been more of a focus on that. But playing devil's advocate and looking at the other side of things, you've only got so much time and resources to focus on let's say like 30 kids in a classroom. Like, every teacher's going to look at that a bit differently and approach it a bit differently. And then you've got what
yeah,
you're being told to do as well. And going back to what you were saying before about the equitable spaces and trying to kind of get everyone on a standardized level, like I completely agree with that. Like, if you look at it like this, like, okay, coming out of school, you need to be able to read, write, calculate things. These are the basics. You often hear people talk about like, okay, I'm not prepared for life. I don't know taxes. I don't know this. Don't know that. I agree. Those things should be in school, but sometimes I think we take for granted like just how important it is, as you said, to like be able to write your name on documents. If you factor in, kids that have, for instance, dyscalculia or dyspraxia or dyslexia, like those are further challenges that those kids are going to have to deal with. And that makes it that much more harder to get to that level where it's like, okay, I've got what I need to move forward. Right.
yeah,
So like the level of resources available and the what you get from teachers is everything. Like when I was at school, there were teachers that didn't try at all, and then there were teachers that really spent time with me, and it paid off. It worked. Sometimes that's a lot of the time that's what kids need, is that push, not necessarily having your hand held, but like that push to realize your potential. you know
yeah. Well, I think you touched on something interesting earlier, where it's like even though that the system, may seek like equality and may speak towards equality and have its sort of aims towards it, right? There is still teacher bias that gets in the way
oh
a
sure,
huge
yeah.
time, especially as you were saying earlier. Like there is a tendency for, and I've done this myself, where it's like if I see a student excelling, right? But I'm kind of like, I guess, on the ends in this regard. If I see a student super struggling, I hyper focus. If I see a student super excelling, I give attention because ultimately, I think it still works with the equitability because it's like if I'm ultimately giving everyone the same foundation, if a student's hyper excelling, right? I think there is something lost in the sense of equality where you start bringing down the super excelling students where it's like no, you want people to hyper excel. Do we have a need for individuals who are hyper excelling? We don't want to beat that down out of them, but at the same time we don't want to leave behind others. So as an educator, like I am okay with that sort of bias towards students that are like excelling. Does that kind of lose out on the mean? Yeah, of course. Like you're always going to miss out on someone with time, but I think ultimately there I understand it, to me it's very understandable to pay attention the most to students who are struggling and hyper excelling because a hyper excelling student, like why not push that potentiality? If that kid's going to be the astrophysicist, they're going to be the quantum computer programmer, if they're going to be the nuclear engineer, great. Like we you want hyper excelling students, right? Like an equitable system should both be able to get everyone at that foundational level and also be able to excel. This goes back to kind of the downtown metaphor. There is always the tallest building. In a city like Tulsa that I live in, there is like one big standout building. There's just one building that just simply towers over the rest, the BOK building. And so sometimes you just have that in a space and that's okay, right? A successful educational system is not one that like levels the playing field. A successful education field a successful educational system is one that has a high field, right? The field is still very high and it puts everyone at a high field, but that field simultaneously creates people that can hyper excel above the rest. I'm with Nietzsche on this one, that like that a lot of one of the things that the Christianization of Western society did, and also the oh my God, what's the word? Expelling in ancient Greek culture, it got rid of the excelling individuals, and like there should be a celebration of excelling. There should be this sort of like, oh my God, these people are amazing. There should be role models and stuff like that. There is a tendency sometimes in society, it's pretty mixed to have this whole Instagram thing where we hyper praise people, but then simultaneously turn around and go like, ugh, but like, why are certain people hyper praised? We're all equal. It's like, no, fuck that. We're not all equal. We're not all this. Like, there are just certain people who are just simply better and better in many regards. You pinpoint certain things like me and you, we can't do maths to save our life. We bring Neil deGrasse Tyson in the room. That man's going to dunk on us mathematics wise. So it's one of these things that I think kind of annoys me in education where it's like we can point to people and be like, these people are simply better. We can celebrate these people and we can celebrate people that are excelling one without bringing others down. We can literally lift up everyone simultaneously and some people may get lifted up higher, but that is just going to happen, right? In the same way that like, it's unlikely, I mean, maybe with the exception of NBA player Jaylen Brown, it is very few exceptions where you have someone who's a hyper genius and like a hyper athlete. There are just different, skill sets that exist. And, people should be appreciated for the skill sets that they have, the hyper excelling artist, the hyper excelling mathematician, historian, etc., whatever it may be. And you don't have to shoot down these sorts of things because, oh no, it's going to affect the sensibilities of others. You can create these spaces where you're both equitable, charitable, praising without demoralizing. And it's a tough balance. I'm not going to say I have the answers to it. I have my certainly progressive tendencies socially, but it's, and there's no like correct answer to this. And I've messed up as an educator myself and trying to find this balance of like, how do I praise the people that are excelling while not making, everyone else feel bad? Like, how do I, bring up people who are at like the bottom of the rung in the class without them noticing that they are, at the bottom rung in the class and still helping them move forward. So it's a tough thing. There's no winner in that sort of regard because there's just so many parties involved. We'll cut this out.
Don't you think there's like a part to it though that where because I've noticed this in workplaces where it's almost the no news is good news thing, where you won't get praised for doing a good job. That's just the expectation. But if you do a bad job, best believe someone's going to say something
Sorry, we'll
about
try. Sorry, well, I guess should we try that again? That's why I meant like cut out the part with the annoying Pontiac.
it. No worries. Though. Do you hear my
Unless we want to leave
question?
that in. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I heard your question where it's in the no good news thing. I don't like that, right? Where it's like the whole like, oh, this is just the expectation. Like, okay, like again, like if you're hitting expectation, one, you should, receive your sort of expected reward from that, right?
Mm,
For example, if you show up to your job, right, you're going to get paid, right? Even if you're just doing the bare minimum, you still get paid, right? Now, if you excel in your job, you should get extra, right? This is not unfounded. So, meeting the expectation should yield a certain reward. There's this whole silly thing of, oh, I did what's expected, therefore I don't get anything for that. Like what that doesn't make any sense. Like meets expectations is what you should be doing. That's what you're expected to do. Anything below that, you start like asking questions. But if you're meeting expectations, fantastic. That's what you're expected to do.
it's a tricky one because I agree with you completely, but I've met so many people and different companies that like look at it totally differently. They, for instance, they'll write it in contracts. You'll see it on like Indeed and places like that where they're like, we're looking for a person who goes, above board, always doing what's the really tired ass way they put it, like above and beyond, going above and beyond to
But then
do,
that just sets a new expectation. Then it's not like then the expectation isn't the expectation. Then the actual expectation is above the expectation. It's just playing
right.
with language. It's a linguistic trick that
No, but
is
like that's
nonsensical.
that's the thing. Like, okay, my very first job, I remember a couple of months in, I was like 18, 19, and I came in all guns blazing, like I was really just giving it my absolute best. And there was an older woman who turned around to me and she said, "You need to dial it back a bit. You need to calm down." And I was like, "No," and I took that as meaning like, "Oh, like, I can do this." Like, what do you mean? Like, I'm just working hard. Like, this is what you have to do. 6 months later, and now I'm introduced to what work is really like. And she said, "Now you see where I'm coming from." And we spoke about it a bit more. And I remember another guy approached me and he said, and this is the best way to put it: the bar that you set when you walk into a new job is the level that you're expected to reach each and every single day. That becomes the expectation that you set coming in. So I know how crazy it sounds, but like, if
No, but
anything,
that's good though. Like for example, like where if you, for example, if you keep moving your bar upward, there is this weird thing that happens in business and even education sometimes to a smaller degree where it's like if you keep on going above that bar, why are we discouraging people from setting a higher and higher and higher and higher and higher bar? This is nonsensical to me, right? Like if you have a classroom, right? For example, I forget what the standards in New Mexico are, but by second grade, let's just say you're supposed to have basic addition and subtraction, right? But you have a student in the room, a second grader, that's able to figure out multiplication. If everyone is still doing the base thing and is still like doing well with the base thing, and this kid's on multiplication for whatever reason, oh, sorry, you have to hold back. Like you can't do multiplication because we're on addition and subtraction. It's like one, you're gonna bore out that kid. Two, you're going to like you're gonna like disincentivize that kid from challenge, right? It's one of those things where it's like we should be setting challenge. One of the things I tried to do as a reading interventionist, there are things that I did outside a little bit outside the curriculum where I'm like I try to push students into a little more spelling, a little more sounding out than the lesson called for each and every time. The problem is that when you create the spaces of equality, you don't create maybe for some people that measure may be a challenge, but if by doing that it's like, hey, we're all on the same challenge. Not everyone is on the same challenge, right? Like the kid that may be in the math class and is struggling with the basic subtraction may go into art class and may be able to produce sketches as well as like Stephen Hillenberg, right? They're just able to be this like great cartoonist or at least have this potentiality for that sort of stuff. And in the same way, you're not going to tell a kid in an art class, oh, actually, you should draw a little bit worse. Your line should be a little more squiggly because everyone else's lines are bad. So why are we in the art class being like, oh yeah, like your lines, no kid has ever been told in art class to draw worse. So then why are we telling people in a math class, in an English class, oh, read at a lower level, add at a lower level? Like this, to me, it doesn't make any, sort of sense. But you can do that, and you could be like, all right, this kid is on, this sort of thing, but we have to make sure that everyone is here. And then if someone else is on there, as a teacher, as a good educator, right, especially, you should be able to pay attention to individual students where they're at and meet their needs, right? If people are at different places in the classroom, as long as everyone's from the same place, you can go from there, and you can give, you can give like a broader lesson to the classroom. And then, that kid that's excelling, you just look at their stuff, really quickly, and, make sure that they have the foundational stuff. And if they're moving ahead, you work with them ahead. And then, you work with the student that's struggling, you're checking on the kids that are in the middle. It's a tough thing. And even in this case, like, I guess the type of stuff I'm proposing would, work better with teaching assistants in every classroom. And of course, that's not going to happen when, teachers aren't always paid, the best. So it is kind of it is kind of like, at least my ideal classroom is something that, I think calls for more educators and more skilled educators, and educators with a lot larger, more Renaissance kind of understandings, as we were kind of alluding to earlier. But I think it's something that would very much, at least, not impossible and not unfeasible, to have multiple educators in a space, and to have educators who aren't necessarily like the experts on anything, because I don't, expect, someone teaching second grade maths to be an expert mathematician, but someone who's able to communicate and engage information, at, let's say 2 grade levels above, right? If you're a second grade teacher, you should be able to teach fourth grade math. If you're a fourth grade, math teachers should be able to teach sixth grade math, stuff like that, where it's like, if you're able to get 2 grade levels above, because realistically, there is, that's about as much of a jump as a student is realistically going to make, is 2 grade levels above at most, right? I mean, it's very rare. Most of the time, like, if a student is like extra excelling, they're a half a grade ahead or a grade ahead. But there are these rare examples where someone is 2 grades ahead. And also, if you're 2 grades ahead in your understanding as a teacher, you're also going to be more easily able to understand, the what's needed for the second grade maths and the second grade reading, and stuff like that. And also, it creates an easier educational space where it's like, because it's very easy for even educators to be hyper specialized, like, oh, I'm just a second grade teacher. Like, people get caught up in the lens of just being a second grade teacher, as opposed to being an elementary school teacher or a high school teacher. And I know I'm definitely weird in this regard. Like, I'm someone who has taught, as stated earlier, first to university. I've learned how to teach at a variety of levels and convey the information. And that should be closer to the norm than what we have now. We have like, oh, I'm a third grade teacher, I'm a second grade teacher, I'm a fourth grade teacher, at least the United States. I don't know the English or Japanese or Chinese equivalents very well, but yeah, so it's this tough sort of thing where, I guess, to summarize what I'm saying, it's like having classrooms where there's a bar that we're making sure that students are getting at, creating spaces where students can be looked at more individually, and having more educators in that space, and having educators who are less hyper specialized with a particular grade level, and teachers who are better able to work at the broader elementary level or middle school level or high school level, as opposed to, just a teacher who is in a particular grade level.
Given that you've taught people of all ages, what's the kind of key difference in your approach to teaching?
Weirdly enough, there isn't any. It's just, the main thing is negotiation. Working with where a student is at is the most important thing. Each and every classroom has a negotiation. Now, if you're teaching a university classroom, you can't negotiate with like recess time or candy like that. I mean, as hilarious as that would be. But one thing that was oddly enough rewarding for like some of my freshman students at Oklahoma State, like, I took some time to like do outdoor classes. And weirdly enough, it was rewarding. It was almost like a recess. Obviously, we're not running around and playing, like we're still doing a lesson, but it was one of those things where it's like, it created a nice space. I even had students like, hey, when are we doing the next outdoor class? Like, so there's still those tendencies within people. Like, we're not as far removed from our childhood stuff and childhood ways of learning as we might think. yes, the concept might get more advanced. Like, as an elementary student, I love paleontology, and I was using the word, but I don't know what the hell an ontology was at the time, or a hermeneutics. Like, there's different information you confront, and you do process it differently. But ultimately, those central foundational things from where we learn from, those basic mechanisms are always just built upon. And so, people aren't as evolved in a weird way, not to say, like, not to undermine people, but in a sense where, like, we're not involved from as evolved from certain childhood tendencies as we may like to think of ourselves. And so it's one of those things where it's like it's negotiating, though. It's negotiating with students, it's negotiating with the space. My syllabus, a lot of professors have a very ironclad syllabus. They're like, this is it, like, we're doing this. And I always call my syllabus is tentative, right? It's a tentative, syllabus. When I was with elementary kids, I would put a planned schedule, right? Because, like, there's always room for changing, and it's like if you see something's not working, you got to switch it around, or that sort of stuff. So I think the commonality is negotiation, and the thing that really changes is where students are at, where their understandings are. Seeing what a classroom needs. In a second grade classroom, I'm not going to do a lecture on how to write a resume, but for my university students, I will definitely do that lecture, and it's super useful. And it's crazy that that stuff doesn't come up sooner, like like how to write a resume, a cover letter, stuff like that. So it's like, that's the only thing that changes, is like what you're compromising on, what you're working on, but the general mechanics of teaching does not change. And that might sound absolutely bizarre to many, and many, I think, would disagree with me. But I think, just from my own experience, being at a variety of levels, this is something I've noticed, that you can that the general mechanisms of teaching are not universal, but are more universalizable. And what changes is what you're negotiating on with students, and what you're where you're working from with particular students.
Speaking of which, how do you motivate unmotivated kids? You know exactly what I'm talking about here. The people that, especially the kids that maybe don't want to be motivated. They want to cause trouble, and that could happen. That could be for a series of reasons. But I'm always kind of fascinated to know how teachers approach this, because every teacher's got their own style.
For me, I like to have very open-ended, like, work on my sort of end, um, as much as possible. Like, how can I get a kid to engage with their own interests? Because that's the most motivating thing you can do, right? Because there's times where it's like, where I mean, this doesn't happen much at the university level, but a student may be like, I don't want to do this activity, and then you respond, but yeah, you could talk about anything you want, like, you can put yourself into it. And also, as an educator, I like to cut around the bullshit. It's like, look, especially, and I do this more so at the university level than the elementary level. It's like, look, I know this is a gen ed for you. I know you're doing this just to get your humanities credit. Like, I know you're doing this for a certain credit. I get it. Like acknowledge the wink, wink, like the game of what's going on. And if you're like in on it, and you're just being open about it, and you're being honest about, like, what's going on, they're going to be more receptive to being like, I got it. You have your obligations to, I get it. And they're more willing to work with you on stuff, because it's like, okay, like, he gets where I'm at. He knows where I'm coming from. He knows what's going on. And he's like, actually cares. He actually wants to help out. He actually not just like, dismissive. So it's about, like, being, I think, honest with students about, like, what's going on and why things are occurring. Like, why are we doing this activity? Why are we doing this assignment? Why are we here? And then two, allowing students to inject their own interests and understandings into, particular assignments as much as possible.
What would you say have been your most challenging experiences as a teacher over the years?
Um, I think the most challenging thing was definitely my first teaching gig was teaching 11th grade high school history over Zoom during the pandemic, and that was just low attendance. So and the school I worked with, was I was teaching Zoom from Florida to an Atlanta metro area public school that, unfortunately, is one of the lower graded schools in the Atlanta metro area. So there was just low attendance, and not a lot of desire, and just a lot of craziness going on with that. So I think But I think starting from that experience, it taught me um, a lot about what's the best way to put this about uh, how bad things could get, and about like it really showed me like, okay, like this is like as bad as things can get. Like this is why we have to be very careful and planned and motivating. Like it taught me a lot about like you can't worry about like what a student is doing, right? You can't just, you can't get on students. You don't jump on students. Your job as an educator is to just do your best, put your best forward, and don't be in a position to just like go after students. Yeah, of course a student may be missing assignments. Of course a student may be messing up and you have to grade accordingly. But you can't go on and blame students for anything, because that's their responsibility. That's their MO, or they have a life situation, so on and so forth. And this is something I've carried, especially at the university level. If a student misses a class, I don't ask for a doctor note. I don't ask for evidence. I take a student at their word. If a student chooses to lie to me, that's their prerogative. That's their MO. That's their conscience. I don't care. I would much rather be in a situation where I just believe a student in each and every case, whereas opposed to I don't believe a student at the wrong time and something actually bad happened. So I think that's sort of something I was able to learn from that experience, where it's like, hey, students have struggles. They have their own lives. Like you can't like, you just have to show up for yourself, and that's all you can do, and just do the best you can for students. And if a student is just not being successful in the class after all of your efforts, you can't let it get to you. You have to just hope. You just have to keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. And don't be excessively harsh on students, because you don't know what's happening in their lives. So I think that's something that people, especially at the higher university levels, miss out on. People with PhDs, I think, often lose touch of, because there's oftentimes cases where someone with a PhD is teaching an intro class, and they lose sight of like what a college freshman is really doing. I remember I had a friend. This was when I was at UCF doing my history bachelor's. He was taking an intro to US history class, and there were just these very obscure subjects like Oklahoma socialists. And he, mind you, this is a guy who's doing sports management, and the median grade, like the average was a 63%. A failing grade was the average for an intro class in history. You're introducing people to U.S. history. You're not trying to get into obscure subjects such as like Oklahoma socialists and very obscure treaties with not minor tribes in the sense that they're unimportant, but minor in the sense like they're not very large tribes in the United States. Like, this isn't an introduction. This isn't, and he asked me to help him out with assignments and stuff like that. And the highest grade I could manage as a history bachelor student, someone who earned their bachelor's from this university, the highest I could manage in this class, like helping out, was a B. A B. I could only get him to a B, as a student there. So it's like that's the type of out of touch that you sometimes see. And it's like it's important for teachers to meet students where they're at and try to understand to the best of their ability where students are at. And so it's just that kind of constant lesson there where it's like it was very obvious where students were at, during the pandemic. And on Zoom, it's like, there's this apathy, there's this concern, there's this worry, there's this, there's even a chance of like, hell yeah, like I don't have to actually go to school. So it's a lot of, there was a lot of just different things going on, and just even being sympathetic with the stuff that's like, less hard, like, because sometimes you just don't want to show up, and like it's okay to be sympathetic with that too, just having an understanding in each and every moment, like where a student could potentially be at, and don't like assume, just like be like, okay, a student, all these are possibilities. A student maybe here, and you just, don't assume the worst with students, but just keep that as a possibility. And as an instructor, just make sure you're doing your best to work with that student so that they can improve in the future.
Solid advice. Thank you for that. What would you say have been your most rewarding experiences as a teacher over the years?
Just seeing any student improve at anything. I very much have this philosophy of that, like, I'm not the most concerned if a student is trying to like learns the main concept that I'm trying to put down. I just want them to learn anything. So anytime I see a student learn anything at all, even if it's not the main thing I was aiming for, even if it's like a little silly fact or a side thing, to me that's a win because all learning can build new learning, right? Even something as silly as I remember I was trying to do a larger lesson on just like on for my second graders on on like amphibians and stuff. And the main thing that was taken away is like how cool axolotls are, and like, hey, did you know like axolotls have gills and like yeah, like they don't like they're not like other salamanders. Look how cool axolotls are. Oh my God, look at they come in all sorts of colors. Look at the colors of the axolotls. So it's like the main thing I'm like trying to teach the basics of what an amphibian is, and just everyone's jumping upon how cool the axolotl is, especially because one of the kids in the class had a pet axolotl,
Oh,
which
sick.
made it even funnier. So it was just one of those things. Like, I have an axolotl, and like so a lot, and I let her kind of like teach like axolotl care for a bit, which was very fun. Where it's like, yeah, so like you feed them this way, you do this with them, so it's like the whole class learned a lot about the axolotl as opposed to amphibians in general. But again, boom, that could potentially spark an interest in biology in general, or just it was just a fun thing to know, or like they see an axolotl in the future and they can tell their parents like, yeah, I learned this, it just it all builds upon. And even at the university level, I had when I did my resume lecture, I had a student that was like, wow, I didn't know I had to put each and every job I've ever done on a resume. Like I thought I just had to put each and every job. So even something as simple as that, where it's like, the main point was how to write a resume. And if that's the only fact that they took from that lecture, oh my God, that's amazing because that's a super important piece of information because, they're trying to go for, let's say, I don't know what their intended job was in the future, but they're going for a marketing job and they put down the fact that they worked at Smoothie King and, like they put every single odd job that they had done, like, that might not be relevant to what they're applying for. It might look a little bit silly, at certain levels. So, it's stuff like that where I think that's the most important thing. It's just like, are you helping someone learn anything at all, really? And beyond that, what more can you do?
Yeah, yeah. I'm lost. I'm at a loss for words there. Yeah, it's spot on. It's really. I'll just say on the side note, it's just really refreshing. Um, your mindset with teaching. I've spoken to teachers on the show before, and nothing is more endearing than like a passionate person, someone who's passionate about educating people and bringing the best out of people. When I think of the teachers that I loved most at school, they were the ones who really pushed me to believe in myself and get something out of education and actually enjoy it, enjoy the process. Like it doesn't have to be this
Yeah,
drab, boring thing. It can be this exciting thing. And like, yeah, you're spot on, man. Like there's always something to be taken away. Might not always be the core thing, but you can pick that up later on. Like I always bring this example, but one of my favorite lecturers at uni had the most boring subject, but he was interesting. Like we
right.
would we would all go to his lectures because he was just so passionate and it was just so interesting to listen to him talk.
He's talking about fluid dynamics or something like that, and you're just like, yes, fluid dynamics, let's go. I don't know what the subject was, but just something like that. But
Well,
but
I
but
can tell you
but
this,
even
I didn't learn a thing in his classes, but I always remember thinking this guy is passionate and I want to be this passionate about things in life.
Yeah,
That
and
was
to
my
me,
takeaway.
that's the true equitable foundation for me, where it's like learning, like the ability to learn and acquire new knowledge, right? Because ultimately, if you have the ability to pick up information, if you teach the ability on how to like pick up information, because that's its own skill, that's where the equitable base should be. The ability to be absorbative of knowledge and information to the best of one's ability. To me, that's the true equitable foundation that that I think is the case, right? The equitable foundation isn't necessarily can you do basic maths, can you write your name. It's like, can you create a system for yourself to be able to learn new skills to the best of your ability? That's what the educational space, I think, is lacking in. It's like it's too focused on shoving in particular facts rather than helping students figure out for themselves how to be able to pick up new facts and new information. And that's why reading and mathematics and these things are so important, because reading especially is the best way to learn for yourself, is to enter the minds of others, to acquire information. And so and mathematics in a weird way is a reading, right? To understand these symbols and how they add up. I mean, of course,
Mm.
there's conceptual maths outside of the physical symbology, but and that could be reequated to things. But again, we want to be able to teach students systems of how can they interact with reality and pick up information for themselves. How can they question information? How can they work off of information? These not necessarily as a love of wisdom, not as a philosophia, but as a sense of not a love of wisdom, but a sort of a ability to acquire wisdom, right? Not even seek it, right? We're not, not every student's gonna be someone who likes to seek information out, but like, what the educational space should be doing, if someone's in a pinch and needs to acquire information, like they need to pick up, a new skill for a job, they need to pick up, they need to, learn taxes, they need to learn this, right? Like they have the foundational ability to be able to figure these things out, right? And that could, also be leaning on tools. It could be right, just for each individual student, like how can we best set up a situation where a student is able to acquire new information and new system, as opposed to being concerned about, teaching and shoving in every bit of information. To me, it's much more useful to give a student the ability to be able to figure out processes for themselves, as opposed to just like, oh, do they get this process and this process is this process and this process? Because the former is just a lot more broad ended and is ultimately going to give a lot more scope and relevant scope, because different people are going to enter different sort of fields. So, and that's I guess this kind of goes to my sort of, I guess, also intrinsic and maybe flawed in part focus on like the students are doing the worst and the students are doing the best. Because if you have a student that's doing the worst, like you need to help them just to acquire any systems at all to learn for themselves. It's like, they're like their foundational ability to pick up information is just lacking for whatever reason. And you need to really figure out a way to like help that student thrive and succeed for themselves, to take on their own challenge. You get like a lot of people with students that are struggling, they just try to like shove information or give the answer, be like, oh, why aren't you just getting this? Where it's like, no, it's like you need to like work with them and really punch in with them, like how to figure out these systems for themselves and be able to create to be able to figure out how to jump from the foundation that you're trying to help them build. And then the student that's excelling and you see them like picking up these new systems, it's like, oh my God, like how many more systems can we help you figure out? Like how many more ways can we figure stuff out for you? Like not like can I give you the answers to everything, but can I create more spaces where you can figure out certain things for yourself, where you can reach conclusions for yourself. Like I almost in a weird way you know view the students that are excelling the most as almost like, can we get you to those philosophical understandings where not only are you able to figure out how certain systems information work, but can we get you to the point where you can start questioning information and start asking, why is this the case? How is this the case? So on and so forth. And because I think that's a pressing skill that a lot of people who are like the thriving the most actually miss out on, because the students who are thriving the most, what teachers will often do is just give them more facts and more piece of information to understand. But that's not the student's problem there. What the student that's typically excelling, what they're actually struggling with the most is then the ability to question information and to ask, okay, like I got all these pieces of information out of the system, but why does the systems work that way? How does it work that way? And that's going to create even more growth for them. Whereas the student who's struggling, they just need that foundation in general. Both have a very important struggle that needs to be addressed. Whereas interestingly enough, I see with the students in the middle, they're weirdly enough more balanced in these regards. A lot of the students that are kind of like in the middle are actually pretty good at questioning why something is the case, right? They're doing well enough to get the information, but they're having enough struggles to also simultaneously question, but wait, why is that the case? How is that the case? Right? So it's interestingly enough, the students are kind of in the middle that they both have somewhat of a foundation and they're not like getting all the information, but they're weirdly enough also better at questioning why information is the case, because they're struggling with it, right? Because they have enough knowledge to understand certain concepts, but not enough to excel. So they start to question. So that's kind of why I don't worry about students as much in the middle, because they have weirdly enough more of a balance between the two main struggles. Not that, of course, I won't help them through struggles or work with them individually where they're at in certain needs in both directions. But I feel like that's kind of my tendency towards these two students, because students of these sort of extremes have more extreme and more pressing struggles. Like often the students that are excelling, weirdly enough, have in a weird way a greater struggle in a sense than the student in the middle, because the student in the middle, they are perfectly built towards what larger systems require of them. They know enough information to meet expectations, right? They're meeting expectations. Therefore, a manager in the business sense is never going to get on them. Like in the professional sense, no one's going to get on them because they're meeting expectations, as opposed to the student that's, thriving and excelling. Like, how can we actually make sure that you're excelling is not going to be taken advantage of? How can we make sure your excelling is not going to be hindered? How can we make sure, your excelling is putting you in a place where you're actually, excelling? And then the student that's struggling, like, how can we make sure you're, able to do stuff? So yeah, it's this weird sort of thing where in the way I think about things, that the middle, is often, weirdly enough, I see as almost being not in the best place, obviously, but being in a place where, certain attentions don't need to be paid in the same way because they're at that meet expectations level. Therefore, there's no major controversy there.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
Yeah.
What has teaching and education taught you about life?
What has it taught me about? See, I don't see. That's a tough thing to say, because I think that's a lot, and I could ramble for a while on that one. But I think the thing that really I think education teaches, it really teaches you about people themselves, as opposed to, anything about life in general. Like, I think education is a sort of gateway into someone's thinking, right? I think that's the most important thing. And also seeing, like, also you could see like larger trends in thinking as a result. So I think that's the thing it teaches you about life, not necessarily like any sort of life lessons, but I think it's more interesting from a psychological and even a mass psychological or even sociological point of view. Like, how are people learning in general? My favorite example of this was um, this was for a composition university course. Around Thanksgiving time, I lectured on a poem written by Richard Blanco, a Cuban poet, and he was talking about Thanksgiving. And he was talking about, one of the things that was a subject of this poem, amongst many things, was the different foods that his family was eating on Thanksgiving. First of all, his family hadn't celebrated Thanksgiving before arriving in the United States, and they only celebrated Thanksgiving because Richard was going to, obviously, an American school, and they're talking about Thanksgiving there. And so he's asking his family, "Hey, are we going to celebrate Thanksgiving? What are we going to do about Thanksgiving?" And his Cuban family just kind of throws something together. And so, and there's a combination of like American food that they're like, it's like, all right, this is what the Americans eat, the gringos eat, and the more traditional, Cuban food. And my students were, some of them were like kind of blown away. A lot of them from North Texas or Oklahoma, which is, not entirely, but it's very Americanized, monocultural in many regards. And so they were like, wait, people eat other food for Thanksgiving? Like, they were just blown away that like it didn't always have to be the standard, turkey, that you could have, arroz con frijoles and, stuff of this manner. But it's interesting to see like that as a phenomenon, and how like that in large part is shaped by education, because that's an educational thing. The information that was given was like, oh yeah, like this is the Thanksgiving food, and how, because like this was instilled and educated into people, like it wasn't, questioned in the same degree until a different educator comes in and is like, here's exposure. So education also highlights like what we expose individuals to, and the results of that exposure, also like how that lends towards certain ways of thinking and so on.
A couple of questions for you, final questions for you, completely unrelated to what we've been speaking about today, but I ask every guest and I can't
Mhm.
wait to ask you, what's the best advice you've ever received?
You know what? I think the problem with best advice ever received is that advice is so contextual. There's this hermeneutic problem with advice, that advice is supposed to be universal, and very little of it is. I mean, the most, I guess, universalizable advice, a lot of it's in like the Tao Te Ching, because it's just so empty in a weird way, right? The the advice of the Taoist, like, a room is useful for its emptiness. These sort of
Yeah.
things, like, outside of like particular almost truisms, you know, someone might look at that phrase and like get it, or someone might be like, no, a room is useful, because of the stuff I have in the room, like not because of the empty space, but then it's like, no, the empty space. So it's like the problem, I think, with advice, it's so pinpointed to, context and need. And so I think the best advice is like what you need in that moment, to push you forward. The best advice, will be that piece of advice that's needed in a given moment. Sometimes the best advice is how you're struggling as an instructor. Sometimes the best advice is like, how you're, maybe, I'm not a parent, but like, how you can improve as a parent or something like that. So yeah, the best advice is the best in your particular state and circumstance. I know it's kind of a cop out, answer,
That's
but
interesting.
I think it's, best is just so hyper subjective, of a term, that there is no best. There is what helps you reach particular ends and desires and goals.
It's a solid point. I mean, what I've discovered, especially over the years, is like sometimes advice that you receive is not relevant in the moment, but becomes relevant years later. As you said, like we're all different. We're different people. We're dealing with different things in life. So, what works for one person doesn't work for another, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting response to that question. Thank you. Yeah, some solid points there. What's the biggest life lesson you've learned so far?
You know, I I think I'm very bad at life, to be quite honest. I don't think I'm very good at life, to be quite honest. I mean, in many ways, like, I do enough stuff where it's interesting to people. I've been lucky to live in multiple states and be decently traveled within my home country. As much as people say that Americans aren't well traveled, we got a big ass country to travel through. So, and there are certainly cultural enclaves within it, but I think, in many ways, like, I'm very bouncy as a person, right? Like, I'm literally transitioning from educating, um, struggling elementary school readers into teaching philosophy at a nationally ranked university. I mean, not like it's a highly nationally ranked. The Wikipedia page is pretty funny in this regard. But it's definitely an improving school. The Wikipedia page is outdated, but they're ranked. The Wikipedia page says St. Thomas University of Miami Gardens is ranked 331 out of 331 of nationally ranked universities. And my friend like circled it, sent me a meme. He's just like, he just like sent that, but then also simultaneously was like, "Hey, it's nationally ranked." So, but it's that weird sort of thing. It's like, I feel like in many ways, to some people, like, that's not how you should do life. Like, so for me, it's like someone that's like bouncing all over the place is that, where it's like, and also I guess even the fact that I'm like concerned about status and stuff like that. So I think one of the things that, um, the only thing that I guess I've gotten this life advice that I think is any bit useful is really kind of the Schopenhauerian, like, pessimistic stuff. Because I think if you work, from this pessimistic, sort of base of things, you kind of really avoid a lot of disappointments. If you're sort of assuming the worst out of things, you're not going to be beat down when things are bad, right? Because it's not going to be as hellishly bad as you imagine. And I think in a weird way, that's almost an oddly that extreme pessimism is almost this weirdly inverted optimism. So yeah, I think honestly the best life advice exists in Schopenhauer. Like, you try to love, but love is like being a hedgehog. Like, you're always going to get hurt, and like, taking on, you know, to work from pessimism, I think is a really, I think, important thing to do. Not because it brings any joy or anything, but if you or do almost like what Marcus Aurelius did, where he assumed that that the entire Roman Empire would collapse every morning. The Stoics meditate on the worst possible thing. It's like, and for Marcus Aurelius, the entire Roman Empire is going to collapse. I'm going to die in battle. Like, he would think of the worst things and then move on um, from there. So I think it's like almost this assuming the worst will inherently lead to something better. So I think that's the best sort of advice. So just assume you're bad at life. Assume you're not doing well. Assume you're like that things are going awry and wrong, and and things can get even worse, and then when you actually take time to examine what's going on, you're like, okay, it could be worse, it could be worse. So I think there's this sort of idea like aim for better, aim what's best. So like, no, think about what's the lowest, the worst, the horrible, the terrible, and I think things get better, from there. Oddly enough.
Solid advice. Thanks for sharing. Final question for you. Do you have any upcoming projects or final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I mean, I think in terms of projects, I am all over the place. Uh, I have like random publications happen all the time. I'm excited about one about optimistic absurdism. That's going to be a lot of fun. I'm working with a lot of smaller hip hop artists, something called recycled raps, where
Oh,
I ask rappers for throwaway lines, and I kind of use some of those lines to create poems out of them. And so, I like to work on a lot of all sorts of all over the place little projects. But my, I guess, next exciting, project for me is, just continuing sharing information to the best of my ability. And I know this definitely, we talked a lot about the educational stuff here as opposed to, the writing stuff I do. But
yeah. I literally,
um,
I feel bad, but like, I don't
no,
know. Sometimes you just got to run with something. Like, do you know what I
no.
mean?
I think it's good to have like a lot going on. Like I
Yeah.
guess another thing, it's like I think it's good, at least for me, to have a lot of project. I guess it's
Mm.
one of the ways in which I feel bad because for me, I'm like I always feel like, oh, I could be doing more, I could be doing more, I could be doing more, I could be at something better, I could be there's more, and like it does definitely lead to a very dissatisfying sort of way of living. But I think at the same time, it leads to like a lot of things that happening and a lot of accomplishments simultaneously. And so if you're someone that cares a lot about like accomplishment and looking good on paper and having a legacy, I guess I definitely lead a sort of life that's good for that. But if you're someone that cares about like contentment, don't don't have a million projects. Don't be like hyper all over the place. Like, find your corner of the earth and enjoy it. But I'm definitely someone that is so just like, oh, I'm here, I'm there, so but yeah,
Same.
I definitely, yeah, I definitely think though, and I think also, and I think it's good to not talk about writing too much because I think the best writers are actually those who do something other than writing. I think Jamaica Kincaid talks about this well. To really write well, you need to learn how to live first. And so I think, having don't not quitting your day job is the most important thing a writer can do. And so that's why I focus a lot more on like the day job stuff than my writing. The writing is something that I think comes, to me. It's like it's something that like hits in a moment. Like I like Tame Impala, I only know, in the moment. Um, and then, but it's really the stuff that you do outside of your writing that truly inspires and breeds into your writing.
Incredible stuff. Just wanted to say a massive thank you for this wonderful show. I've learned
No,
a
thank
hell
you
of a
for
lot.
having me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, man. I knew
Thank
it
you
was
for
going to
having
be.
me in weird outdoor circumstances. Thankfully, a tornado has not flown through our podcast, which is not founded in this state. So, you know,
Don't know how you
all
guys
good.
deal with
But
it, man. It's terrifying.
you know what? I mean, people watch them, man. Like there's plenty of videos where it's like, oh, where the tornadoes outside. Let's just watch it. So, I mean, I'm not from here originally. I'm a Floridian, so it's
Yeah,
something I've had to become accustomed to for sure. But in the same way, like Oklahomans will be like, well, how do you deal with a hurricane? So there's always something everywhere. Unless you're in like New Mexico, they have very little wildfires, but like those are usually well outside of the cities, but not that they don't affect people. Obviously, Las Vegas, New Mexico had like that area had a lot of pretty like a year or two ago had a lot of like devastating wildfires there. But yeah, you just you're accustomed to what you're used to.
again, massive thank you for being on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, I wish you the very best. I would love to get you back
Same
on the
here.
show to actually talk about poetry and writing. I feel because
Yeah.
we've covered education and teaching. That's one. That's
Yep.
I'm sure my listeners are going to love this. But yeah, would love to get you back on to talk about those things
a
if you'd
hundred
be open
percent.
to that.
I would be more than open to that in the future for sure.
Wicked, wicked.
Oh
Glad to
yeah,
hear it.
gotta talk about Basho and Rumi and just a lot of my, I think my hot takes on this sort of stuff is good. I think I have a lot of poetry hot takes, so I would look forward to talking about that for sure.
Excellent, man. Yeah, once again, thank you very much. And to all the listeners of the Christian Reeve podcast, let me know what you thought about this show. I mean, I thought it was brilliant. I've had a really good time. I've learned a lot. Hope you guys have learned a lot. If you would like to show your love to the show, you can do so by, if it's on YouTube, liking, sharing, subscribing, leaving the comments. I'm seeing all of them. It really, really helps us out. I'm seeing a slight increase in views lately and listens. So we are building that audience. So hello to all the new people listening. Thank you so much for listening. As I said at the beginning, we're 4 years in. We're ever approaching 300 episodes, so it's exciting territory to be able to get to that point. And yeah, let me know who you'd like to see on the show next, what you'd like to see on the show next. And make sure, as I said, wherever you listen to the show, make sure to leave us a rating, a review. All of these things help me, they help the show, they help everything in between. If you'd like to support the show and support me in producing the show, make sure to subscribe to patreon.com/Christian Reeve, and you can get yourself access to a lot of bonus content, including bonus content from the podcast. I will be leaving links in the description on where you can find Anthony's work as well. And as always, be safe, be well, and I'll see you in the next one.